Hello folks, Dick Fairburn here, talking about defensive handgun cartridges. Just talked about the 38 in the last episode. Been around for a very long time, still out there, still viable. And then there is its son, the 357 Magnum. Just a little bit longer than the 38. I'll show you close-ups of these things. They extended the case a little longer. They added a bigger powder charge. They upped the pressure level of the cartridge and made a whole new beast out of it. 357, good defensive cartridge today. Stick around, we'll talk about it. Okay, the 357 was introduced by Smith & Wesson in a pistol called the 357 Magnum before they had model numbers. And those early guns are called registered guns because they were made specifically to fit the needs of one purchaser, and they were registered to that person. So the registered 357s bring a premium for collectors out there nowadays. It evolved into things like a stainless steel revolver with a snub-nosed barrel. So the 357 has been around a long time, gone through a lot of changes, but it's a viable self-defense cartridge. Now those original 357s were built on what Smith & Wesson called their N frame. The N frame is also what they used to build 41 Magnums, 44 Magnums. So it's a pretty big, heavy revolver. A lot of Border Patrol officers, people that worked outdoors, they liked those 357s. They wanted more punch. They wanted a little bit more reach if they needed it. And a guy that a lot of you have heard of, Bill Jordan, was a Border Patrol shooter. He was even a demo shooter for the NRA, doing some very skilled demonstrations with these. He asked Smith & Wesson to build a lighter one. He said, the N frame is good. It probably holds up well to the 357, but I'd like to see a lighter revolver for cops to carry. So they moved back to their K frame and they built one called a Model 19, or in the stainless steel version, a Model 66. And that quickly became the police revolver cartridge for the people who wanted to carry a 357 Magnum. In the 80s, because these things can be worn out pretty badly with a lot of full charge 357 loads, Smith & Wesson created a new frame, or reintroduced an old frame, I'm not sure which, that they called an L frame, Model 686. It was just a little bit bigger than the 19 or 66, a little bit bigger cylinder diameter, a little heavier frame, and they thought that would stand up better to a lot of hard use with 357 loads. Colt double action revolvers for the 357 started with a model called the Trooper, which I had one of and wish I had kept. This is not the Trooper Mark III or the Trooper Mark V that they made many years later in their history. The original Trooper was on their E frame, and the Trooper was successful, had a 4-inch or 6-inch barrel, adjustable sights. You know, we can argue forever which has the smoothest action, a Smith & Wesson or a Colt. I think Smith & Wessons tend to come with a little bit smoother trigger action, but Colts can be tuned up to be just as good, maybe better. When Colt started phasing out that Trooper Model 357, what they really did was screw out the standard looking barrel. They screwed one in with a vent rib, and they came in 2.5, 4-inch, 6-inch, I think a few 8s were made, 357s. And interestingly, when the L frame Smith came out, a 686, I got one. And I got an early one, so there were no speed loaders available for it. So I tried what I had, and what I found was that the cylinder diameter of the L-frame Smith is exactly the same as for a Colt Python, or that older model Trooper that I had. So the speed loaders would interchange. So what Smith & Wesson did really was beef up the 19, the 66s to a little bit bigger revolver and matched the size that Colt had been building for a long time. And I'm a Colt guy. I'm not going to say that I'm not. I personally think the Python was arguably the finest revolver ever made by anybody. And that's reflected in the prices of those used Pythons. Now the Python is back in the market with Colt, but it is not the original Python lockwork. It's a different build. They've streamlined it. They've been able to produce it for a lot lower cost than they would have to if they went back to that hand-fitted Python action of old. And I have no experience with the new Pythons, but I keep buying chances at it at Friends of NRI banquets, so maybe I'll win one someday. The early 357 Magnums came in several barrel lengths. Typically, 6-inch was for those people who wanted to reach out and do some work with it. They came as long as 8 3/8, and Mr. Wesson of Smith & Wesson, when the 357 came out, he immediately started hunting big stuff all over the world to prove that this 357 was the most powerful handgun on earth at that time. And those were typically with 8-inch barrels. Cops tended to go with either 6s or 4s. You know, when you started, you thought a 6 was great because you could shoot really well with it. But then getting that holster jammed up in your ribs with that long barrel on the seat of the car got old, so then they tended to go to 4s. As they got older and fatter and lazier, a lot of times they went to 2.5s, but then they found they're really loud, they're more recoil, can't shoot them quite as well. They'd find their old 4-inch, and that was kind of the sweet spot for people who carried a 357 on a daily basis, was a 4-inch barrel. Now, a lot of that world's most powerful handgun effect went away when you went to a 4 or 2.5-inch barrel, because the velocity came down substantially from the long barrel loads. You almost never see a revolver in the holster of a police officer nowadays. It's almost unheard of. I see them with security guards driving armored cars, occasionally things like that. The last police officer I saw wearing a revolver, and this was probably 20 years ago, was a sheriff at a county here in Illinois. And he was a class act. He carried a 6-inch Python. But today, we see none of them hardly being used for duty use at all. So where does the 357 fit into our scheme of self-defense cartridges? Obviously, it is more powerful than the 38. And that's a good thing. The 38 is adequate at best. 357 throws a lot more power. The shorter barrels are probably the most commonly used for people who carry a 357 for concealed carry. They're both 2.5 and 3-inch barrels. I would go with the 3-inch myself. And the same thing holds true with the 357 Magnum. Shorter barrel, shorter ejector rod. If I put a full-size case in there and I just push that to there, it's not out. I've got for loaded rounds, a 1/2 inch. For empty cases, at least 1/4 inch shy of pushing those out. And since 357s work at higher pressure than 38s, they generally have to be pushed out. Very rarely do you turn it up and they fall out on their own. So it's imperative that you smack that pretty hard. If you just push it softly, you're probably not going to eject those cases with a short barrel. 3-inch adds a little bit of ejector rod, clears up that problem. So that's an advantage to a slightly longer than 2.5-inch barrel. These are heavy. They're generally no heavier than a full-size type semi-automatic, but when you look at the polymer guns or alloy frame Colt Commanders or something like that, you're going to be lugging more weight with you than you will with a semi-automatic. And as I mentioned with the 38, you have the width of the cylinder, so they're bulkier. But I think they're viable. You've only got 6 rounds. You've got to decide if you're going to load with speed strips or speed loaders. Speed loaders are bulkier and more awkward to carry, but they're a lot faster to use. But I think it is a viable cartridge for self-defense. Now, when cops were shooting 357s, there were 2 loads that were known to be top performers, and they both performed pretty well in our police marksman study that we did in the 1990s. And that was 241 incidents that were reported on by officers who were involved in the shooting. So these are officers who won the fight, able to tell us what happened. And we learned a lot about distances that were involved, how many shots were fired, how many adversaries they faced, which I think there might have been only 1 or 2 cases where they had more than one adversary. So that's why I say 6 rounds is probably enough. That multiple adversary kind of pack criminal mentality is growing a bit. So we may get to the point where you do need more rounds. But those multiple adversary events are still pretty uncommon. The first load that did really well in the police marksman stopping power study, just about a point behind the old 38 lead semi-wad cutter hollow point, was a 125 grain jacketed hollow point. The 158 grain was the traditional weight for this for the 357, the same as it had been in the 38. And from a short revolver, 2.5 to 4 inch revolver, they tended not to expand hardly at all. They tended to penetrate much deeper than you really needed. But the 125 was kind of a sweet spot. It would expand, sometimes violently, even fragment badly, gave adequate penetration, not really deep penetration, but for the most part, good penetration. And it had a pretty good track record, like 77% stops with that 125 grain load. Another load that we didn't have as many records with, and it was a duty load I carried, the sheriff's office in Wyoming. Winchester had a 145 grain silver tip load. And the silver tip load was, compared to the other 357s, I'm sure it was, some special powder that they had developed, but it was almost a plus P version of the 357. So that 145 was hot. And it launched that at about 1450 feet per second, where the 125 tended to be around 1400 out of a 4-inch gun. That 145 was even faster, even though it was heavier, and it was about 1450 from the loads that I chronographed. Hot load, expanded well, penetrated well, and both of those loads are still available. Most of the manufacturers make a 125 jacketed hollow point. Winchester still makes that 145 silver tip, so those would be great loads to carry in a 357. Now they're full charge loads, and they're going to buck and jump a bit. Shooting from a K-frame like this 66 is one thing, but Smith & Wesson makes 5-shot J-frame chambered for the 357. And I mentioned in one of the other videos, I got one of the first ones out on the market for a test article one time. And on a dare, at qualification day, somebody dared me to run a 50-round qual course at a police event with Magnum loads in that little J-frame. Now, it was all steel. It was not an alloy frame. But these Federal 125 jacketed hollow points, I had a box of them. So I ran 50 rounds through that thing. I made qualification with it with points to spare. And at the time, when you got test guns from the manufacturers, a lot of times you could buy them at close to half price for writers. With the advent of YouTube, there are so many people out there that think they're gun writers nowadays that most of the gun companies aren't as friendly as they were then. So I typically bought whatever Smith & Wesson or Colt or somebody sent me just because it was a heck of a deal. And if I didn't want it, I'd sell it to somebody and make a couple bucks. I sold that revolver the next day. It was absolutely brutal to fire those little 5-shot J-frame revolvers with full 357 Magnum loads. If you've got one of those, shoot a load that you can handle. Shoot the lead semi-wad cutter hollow point. Probably not even a plus P. Winchester loads it as a plus P. Federal, I believe, still makes it as a non-plus P. Or perhaps even a lighter load. The recoil on those is ridiculous. If you're going out to buy a new snub nose revolver, I personally don't recommend you buy one at something smaller than the K-frame Smith & Wesson or the equivalent size in a Colt. Those really small 357s are just vicious to shoot, and they're not very practical for that regard. That's my opinion. Speaking of the recoil of a 357 Magnum, there's another kind of weapon out there that some people choose for self-defense that I don't necessarily recommend. If you want it as a backup, last resort gun, that's okay. But that's a 2-shot over and under Derringer. And I had a cowboy buddy in Wyoming who he wanted to get a 2-shot Derringer carrying the top of his boots. Easy way to conceal it. He wasn't concerned about bad guys all that much, but he'd like to have a couple rounds with him just in case. And when he went to buy it from the gun store, they were going to order it for him. He found out that the 38 special model was the same price as the 357 Magnum model. So he said, well, hell, give me the 357. I can always shoot 38s in it. That's true. Wasn't a very accurate little thing. It worked reliably enough, but I mean, we're talking belly gun. It's not going to be effective at much more than 3 or 4 yards. But he made the mistake of handing it to me to shoot one time on the range, and I fired a few rounds, and then when I handed it back to him, I had dropped in a couple of those 357 Magnum silver tips, 145 grains. I handed it back to him. He didn't look, so that I figured it was his own damn fault. But he cocked the hammer back on that thing, and when it went off, it jumped up out of his hand, went flying over and landed in the dirt, and it actually split him. It drew a little blood from the recoil of that thing. And he drew a little blood with, burned my ears a little bit, calling me bad names, but I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. That's why I say the 357 is sometimes more than you can handle recoil-wise. So if you're going to carry a 357, you need to get out and shoot it a lot. And you need to shoot it with the loads you're going to carry, enough to see if you can handle them under stress. You can do the bulk of your practice with lighter load 38s. It's less money, it's less wear and tear on the revolver, it's less wear and tear on the shooter. But you need to shoot a lot of your carry load to make sure you can handle that thing under stress, you can reload it under stress, and be able to manage this 6-shot weapon as effectively as you can. So where do I put the 357 on this continuum of self-defense cartridges? 380 is kind of at my bottom. I said it was marginal. 9mm, 38s, adequate. The 45 ACP I called reliable. The 40 I called reliable as well. And in fact, I called 40 for police use. I kind of called it the Goldilocks cartridge. It's not too big, it's not too little. It's really just kind of right. So where's the 357 stack up? I'm assuming you're going to be shooting it from a 2.5 to 3 inch barrel. So we're going to base the velocities of our terminal performance at that range. I think depending on the load you use, it can go from adequate to reliable. If you're shooting the lead semi-wad cutter hollow points, the lighter 38 loads, which still can perform very, very well, then it's certainly adequate. If you go to the 125 hollow point or the 145 silver tip, and you can handle them well under stress, you can make rapid fire hits with those, then I think you're up into reliable. You've got a cartridge that's delivering the performance equal to or perhaps even a little better than the beloved 45 ACP. And it's going to depend on what you carry. The kind of ammo, the kind of skill you have, the kind of skill you have in continuity of fire. Can I fire these 6, knock them out, smack them out, speed loader in, 6 more on target? Because if I do face multiple targets, I want to put 1 or 2 hits on each one of them. So that's going to burn up my 6 rounds in a 357. If you got a 5-shot J-frame 357, we're getting marginal. So that's my idea of 357. It was a good man-stopper in the days when it was very common for police officers. I have no reason to think it would not be a good man-stopper now. We don't see revolvers being carried for self-defense as much as semi-autos. But if you've got one and you like it and you're good with it, I think you're good to go. Now, I'm going to move into 3 cartridges that are not as widely used. One of them's still pretty common, the other 2 are not. But they really can give you the same performance of this 2.5 to 3 inch 357, maybe even a 4 inch 357. And they can do it in a lightweight semi-auto pistol with a higher round count. I'm going to lump 3 cartridges together. I call them the Super 9s. That's the 38 Super, the 357 SIG, and the Winchester 9x23. When they are all loaded in high quality brass with similar barrel lengths, they can give similar performance. And the performance they give is very much like the 125 hollow point from the 357 revolver. So next up, we're going to talk about the Super 9s. Folks, I ask you to subscribe, give me a like if you think these videos are worth it. Be safe out there. Okay, we got them both here now. You ready? Bud got one. Ginger got one. Oh, she missed it. She usually gets them, doesn't she, Bud? Okay, girl, last one. You ready? You ready? Yeah! That's all there is till next time.